This week on Jerusalem Dateline, as tensions flare between the U.S. and Iran, a picture emerges of an Iran that few are seeing.
When Muslims from Iran come in contact with the man from Nazareth, something beautiful happens.
And some of the most recent archaeological discoveries, from the road pilgrims took to the temple in Jesus' day to ancient Ziklag, where David escaped King Saul. All this and more this week on Jerusalem Dateline. Hello and welcome to this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. I'm Julie Stahl, filling in for Chris Mitchell. As tensions between the U.S. and Iran continue to rise, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu expressed his appreciation for President Trump's intention to increase sanctions against Iran. The two leaders spoke by phone about regional developments and security issues. For more on the growing crisis with Iran, here's CBN News White House correspondent Ben Kennedy.
President Trump first warned Iran that it better be careful. Now the vice president says while the U.S. does not seek war with Iran, it'll not back down.
We've implemented a maximum pressure campaign.
And Iran is using that campaign as the reason for enriching uranium at greater levels. China calls it the root cause of the crisis, combined with the U.S. pulling out of the 2015 agreement.
Now Iran must choose between caring for its people and continuing to fund its proxies who spread violence and terrorism throughout the region and breathe out murderous hatred against Israel.
Pence spoke at the Christians United for Israel summit in D.C., adding that the U.S. is willing to talk to Iran and will also be prepared to protect itself and its allies.
Iran should not confuse American restraint with a lack of American resolve.
Britain warned Iran to stop its uranium enrichment, while Israel is urging world powers to impose more sanctions.
We should stand up to Iran's aggression now, and Europe should back the sanctions instituted by President Trump. We certainly do.
We've implemented the strongest pressure campaign in history against the Iranian regime, and we are not done. We've cut off billions in funds that the Islamic Republic of Iran's leadership would have used for various nefarious purposes, not the least of which would have been their efforts to destroy the state of Israel.
Germany says it is extremely concerned, but stops short with an immediate response until after an inspection report is released. Then they plan to discuss those findings with Britain, China, France, and Russia on how to proceed with the nuclear pact. Ben Kennedy, CBN News, Washington.
It may surprise you to learn that the fastest growing church in the world is in Iran. Yet that's the assessment of those who have seen and heard the remarkable story of millions turning away from the Iranian regime's Shiite Islam and turning toward Jesus Christ. We've hidden the identity of the believers in this story, many of whom are Iranian Christians in another country. Here's CBN News Middle East Bureau Chief Chris Mitchell.
The image Iran presents to the world is large demonstrations with shouts of death to America and death to Israel. Those who have seen Iran from the inside, however, paint a very different picture.
All the protests that you see in the streets, those are mostly contrived. There are young students in the streets, and they've told us, if we don't go to the streets, we won't get our grades, so we're forced to go and protest.
We've hidden the identity of this Iranian church worker. He says there are two Irans, the one you see on the news and the other hidden from the world.
Yes, I would say there's a 10% Iran and a 90% Iran. 10% control the country in a more oppressive manner, hardline religious manner, and then the majority of the people, 90% of the people, love America. They don't hate Americans. I think that's the message that Americans need to hear. They tell us all the time, we don't hate Americans, we love America.
He wants Americans to know that 40 years after Iran's Islamic Revolution, there's another spiritual revolution underway.
More people have come to faith in Iran in the last 40 years than the previous 1,400 years. So there's a once, not only in a lifetime, but in history, where we have a moment where Iranians are coming to faith at such a rapid rate.
Frontiers Alliance International is producing a documentary called Sheep Among Wolves to introduce the Iranian church to Christians worldwide.
It's the fastest growing church in the world that owns no buildings, has no 501c3s, that owns no property, that has no bank accounts, that has no centralized leadership, that has no denominational leanings, and yet it's multiplying like crazy. What the Lord is doing there is staggering.
And that results in intense persecution that Thomas says leads Iranian believers to seek prayer, but not in a way you may think.
Typically the way we pray is, we expect that they want us to pray for the persecution to end, and they say, no, don't do that. Persecution is growing the church. When the persecution stops, the growth stops. What we want is for the gospel to spread far and wide and deep in Iran.
With Iran and the U.S. on the brink of war, Thomas says it's important to see what's happening behind the Iranian veil.
When Muslims from Iran come in contact with the man from Nazareth, something beautiful happens. And when they realize that they've been bought and saved and purchased with Jewish blood, prophesied by Jewish prophets in the Jewish Bible, something crazy happens, something beautiful happens, and that's what we're seeing take place in Iran.
Thomas believes one day the world may wake up to find Iran's church growth in the 21st century rivaling that of China and Korea in the last century.
A road project is underway in Jerusalem, but it's not about easing traffic jams. Archaeologists are opening the ancient road that Jewish worshippers would have climbed on their way to the temple 2,000 years ago. But an opening ceremony drew fire from Palestinians who said the discovery was a fake and a hoax. U.S. Ambassador to Israel David Friedman, who was part of the ceremony, said later that the Palestinian reaction showed why Israeli-Palestinian peace has been so elusive.
The point I want to make here is very simple. If you are anti-history, you are anti-peace. If you seek to deny other people's heritage, you cannot make peace with them. If you seek to deny the connection of the Jewish people to their ancient and modern capital, Jerusalem, there is just not much to discuss.
Take a look at the ceremony that sparked what Friedman called the worst level of vitriol he'd seen since he became ambassador more than 2 years ago.
U.S. Ambassador to Israel David Friedman broke through a symbolic wall onto the pilgrimage path.
But were there ever any doubt about the accuracy, the wisdom, the propriety of President Trump recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, I certainly think this lays all doubts to rest.
Within a few months, visitors will be able to walk all the way from the Pool of Siloam up to here, the halfway point on the pilgrimage road.
We have thousands and thousands of finds here that have been made by Israel Antiquities Authority archaeologists. You see the flagstones of the road, you find them here at the pool, and you see the exact same flagstones at the end near the Temple Mount itself.
And to those who observe the Christian faith, to feel the steps of Jesus as he walked as a Jewish pilgrim, as he ascended to the temple, his visits, of course, to the temple, well known and well documented. It is an intact, living, breathing piece of history that every one of us has the opportunity to experience for ourselves.
Ze'ev Orenstein of the City of David Foundation says a key part of this discovery is its authenticity.
Everything that we have here is original. Where we find the road, you see the road. In the areas where there's destruction, that's what you see. And then when you find the road again, that's what there is. The idea is to preserve the ancient pilgrimage road as authentically as possible.
That will give visitors a chance to taste what life was like in the time of the Bible.
Coming up, the ancient biblical superhighway.
Roman soldiers destroy the Second Temple of Jerusalem. Centuries of eyewitnesses say the temple treasures survived. But where are they?
They went from Jerusalem to Rome, Rome to Carthage, Carthage to Byzantium.
Historians are silent about what happened to it next.
CBN Documentaries presents the worldwide release of Treasures of the Second Temple.
So does it still exist today?
A story of mystery.
Where is it?
Calamity.
Most of the victims were butchered.
And destiny.
The possibility to dig is impossible.
Get your copy of Treasures of the Second Temple. Yours for a gift of any amount to CBN Documentaries.
Remember for a moment what it was like to be a child. You believed
every story you were told. You saw a world full of endless possibilities. What stories will the world's orphaned and at-risk children believe? We believe the Bible tells the only story truly worth believing. We believe that every child should have the opportunity to dream, the chance to take challenges and turn them into possibilities, the chance to stand on the promises of God, to recognize their place in the greatest story ever told. They have their whole lives ahead of them. Theirs is a world of endless possibilities. They are looking for a story to believe. We will tell them that story. Will you join us?
In ancient Israel, the Jewish people obeyed the biblical commandment to travel to Jerusalem 3 times a year for a temple sacrifice. As we mentioned earlier, now for the first time in 2,000 years, the road they walked is being uncovered for all to see. CBN Middle East Bureau Chief Chris Mitchell takes us on that ancient highway.
They call it the Biblical Superhighway, the Pilgrim's Path that led to the Jewish temple in ancient times.
The places and events and the peoples that make Jerusalem, Jerusalem. For Christians, for Jews, it all happened here in the city of David. This is where the beating heart of Jerusalem is. We're talking about the Pool of Siloam. We're talking about Mount Moriah, the Temple Mount. We're talking about the city of David. The pilgrimage road links them all together.
For Jews in ancient days, their pilgrimage began here at the Pool of Siloam. It's a mikveh or ritual bath. It's the size of 2 Olympic swimming pools. They would purify themselves here before going up to the Temple Mount to worship God.
The historian Josephus says that 2,000 years ago, on the pilgrimage festivals, there would have been more than 2 million people going up on pilgrimage. That's a lot of people who need to bathe.
The pool is also where Jesus healed the blind man, as recounted in the book of John. Its location was hidden by a road until 15 years ago, when a sewage leak led to excavations, the discovery of the pool, and much more.
The archaeologists, when they find the Pool of Siloam, so they understand if that's the pool, and they know where the temple stood on the Temple Mount some 2,000 years ago, the same Temple Mount as today.
Zev Orenstein with the City of David Foundation says archaeologists wondered how the pilgrims traveled from the pool to the Temple Mount.
So the archaeologists widened the excavation, and we are standing on the very answer to that question. We are standing atop the ancient pilgrimage road.
These are the stones that Jesus would have walked on his way up to the temple. And now the significance of the excavation of the pilgrimage road is that for the first time in 2,000 years, visitors will be able to walk all the way from the Pool of Siloam up to the Western Wall.
The word in the Bible, the Hebrew words, is aliyah l'regel, or ole regel. Now, what we understand that to mean is it's a spiritual ascent. You're going up to the temple, going to Jerusalem. It's a very holy place. But Chris, when you're in the place where the Bible happened, the words of the Bible come to life. Because as we're walking right now, and I'm sure you could feel it, we're walking uphill.
And it was more than that.
This would have been like Times Square. You would have had on both sides of the road, and keep in mind, the road is about 3, 4, 5 times wider than what we see over here. You would have had shops, stalls along both sides of the road. This is the center of Jerusalem from a spiritual perspective, from a communal perspective, also from a commerce perspective.
According to the Israel Antiquities Authority, the road took 10 years to build, from 20 to 30 AD, and was constructed by Pontius Pilate.
One of the major issues of Jerusalem is that it's a living city. All the layers, all the archaeological layers are built on top of one another, and the modern living quarters and everything is built on top of the archaeological layers.
Excavation manager Ari Levy says uncovering the road is a major engineering feat.
We have modern neighborhood just above our heads, and we don't want it to collapse. After each meter that we take out, each meter of soil, we enter an arch-like construction like this. This supports the entire weight of what we have above us.
Along the route, you can see many places where the road remains intact and others where it's destroyed, given its violent history.
We know that the Romans, they destroyed Jerusalem. And if you would find everything perfectly intact, well, it wouldn't seem like much of a destruction.
Among the discovered treasures are small coins minted during the Great Jewish Revolt, before the Romans destroyed the Temple and Jerusalem in 70 AD. Scholars often wonder why the Jews made worthless coins instead of weapons. Orenstein has the answer.
Jews of Jerusalem understood that the Romans were likely going to destroy the city, but they also believed that one day in the future, their descendants would return and find these coins, and they would know what their ancestors lived and died for a free Jerusalem. And here we are nearly 2,000 years later, standing along the very same pilgrimage road here in the city of David, in Jerusalem, the capital of the Jewish state of Israel.
Half of the pilgrimage road will open soon to the public, and within a few years, all the way from the Pool of Siloam to the Western Wall. That will give visitors a first-hand experience of what it was like to worship God in the time of Jesus.
Coming up, an ancient discovery that gives archaeologists new clues about the biblical time of King David.
We will move the American embassy to the eternal capital of the Jewish people, Jerusalem.
As the nations rage, you can stand with Israel.
History is being written, and I want to be a part of it.
Call 1-800-700-7000 and get to life.
This is our nature as a country.
Discover the untold story of how Israeli volunteers are changing the world.
We consider it our duty to reach out and help others around the world.
For a gift of $10 or more, you can own the acclaimed CBN documentary To Life.
To treat a human, no matter what he is, which religious he has, which color he is. This is what I'm doing.
Support Israel in their time of need. Get to Life, now available on DVD. Call 1-800-700-7000 or log on to cbn.com.
And I wish that other people throughout the world could see this side of Israel.
Orphans Promise is committed to loving and serving at-risk children, to helping keep families together, and to creating opportunities for strong and sustainable communities around the world. We're working in over 60 countries around the world, and with your help, we can do even more. There's an old African proverb I love that says, if you want to run fast, run alone. But if you want to run far, run together. At Orphans Promise, we want to run far so we can touch the lives of as many orphaned and vulnerable children as possible. But we don't want to go alone. We're out to change the world, one child, one family, one community at a time. Will you join us?
Archaeologists believe they have found the biblical location where David hid from King Saul. Take a look at what we saw when we went to the Philistine town known as Ziklag. Pottery dating to the time of King David, geography, and biblical history all point to Khirbet Arai as the Philistine town of Ziklag where David escaped King Saul.
Is the best candidate in the entire region.
Over the years, experts have identified 11 different sites as possible locations for Ziklag, but archaeologists now believe they have evidence linking this site to the Ziklag of King David.
People debate about Ziklag already in the 7th century, so people really had interest about the site. If you're taking the biblical narrative, it's mentioned only in the time of King David.
The Bible says David fled to Achish at Gath or Gat with 600 men and 2 of his wives. Then David said to Achish, "If I have now found favor in your eyes, let them give me a place in some town in the country that I may dwell there. For why should your servant dwell in the royal city with you?" So Achish gave him Ziklag that day. Ziklag has belonged to the kings of Judah to this day.
Achish and Gat are about half-day walk from here. Ziklag cannot be far away in the Negev. It had to be close to Gat. Then we are told that Ziklag became part of the kings of Judah. So it cannot be on the coastal plain near Ashkelon and Ashdod. It had to be here on the border between the lowland and the highland. So this site perfectly matched these requirements.
Hebrew University archaeologist Yosef Garfinkel points out why this is different from other proposed locations.
This was a site which has Philistine background, and later it became Judean. And if you take the other site which has been proposed to be Ziklag, if they don't have a level from the time of David, how can they be Ziklag? And in the end, this is the only site which made the geographical and the historical together.
And then there's the pottery.
We are in the east side of the site, but it's magnificent because over here, this is the rooms that we found all the pottery vessels, the complete vessels, the massive destruction. This is the place that we collected the carbon-14 seeds, and this is the place that we're dating to the time of King David.
Workers here uncovered dozens of 3,000-year-old vessels.
All these vessels and 70 others all came from the level that is dated by radiocarbon sample to the early 10th century BC. So you can see here vessels that maybe King David used them, maybe he didn't, but this is the vessels which were used in the time of King David.
The Bible also describes the burning of Ziklag while David and his men were out at war. Archaeologist Sa'ar Ganor says even signs of that attack are clear.
The period is correct, and the pottery vessel in the destruction is great for us, not for them. And it means that we have all the connection to the Bible, to David, to the 10th century. And now we can say that we have a lot of points on the map that connecting to the 10th century BCE. It means that Judea, the kingdom of Judah was here before 3,000 years.
12 years ago, we didn't have even one archaeological site from the time of King David in all Israel. And then people start debating, maybe David never existed and he's just a mythological figure, or maybe he existed, but he was only a Bedouin sheikh living in a tent, so nothing was really left from his period.
Now with this second site in the Judean hills linked to King David, Garfinkel believes more sites will be uncovered to support the history of King David and the biblical narrative. Still ahead, cutting-edge DNA testing reveals that the Philistines of the Bible came from European descent.
I am Region's first ROTC graduate student.
When you give,
smiles grow bigger. When you care, homes are happier. When you comfort, the hurt goes away. When we all come together to love, miracles happen.
3 years ago, archaeologists digging in Israel revealed they had excavated a Philistine cemetery for the first time ever. Now, a report on the bones they uncovered has confirmed the origins of the Philistines, one of the key enemies of the biblical Israelites. State-of-the-art DNA testing on the ancient Philistine bones showed they came from Europe more than 3,000 years ago.
We've been able to demonstrate for the first time that the Philistines were immigrants to the region of Philistia.
Ancient Philistia was located along the modern-day southern coast of Israel and Gaza. Archaeologist Daniel Master headed the Leon Levy expedition to Ashkelon.
In the 13th and 12th century, empires collapsed. Indeed, much of civilization collapsed. And when people woke up 100 years later, the world was very different. One of the groups that people noticed were the Philistines.
Master said the DNA confirmed what they already believed.
From the early 20th century, people noticed that the styles of pottery that they were finding in the area called Philistia by the writers of the Hebrew Bible were similar to pottery that was found in Greece just 100 years earlier. And people started to draw the connection that perhaps this pottery indicated some connection between these two groups of people.
Ashkelon was one of 5 big Philistine cities. The Philistines lived there for about 600 years.
The Philistines appear in the Hebrew Bible as one of the great enemies of the Israelites. But where did they come from? In the Bible, there's a mention that the Philistines came from Caphtor. This is a mention in Amos, many centuries after we think the Philistines arrived. This place was probably related to Crete.
The cemetery, discovered in 2013, is dated from the 11th to the 8th century BC.
And how do we tell the story of people who can't speak for themselves, that haven't left behind written texts? We can look at the scraps and the garbage that they've left behind. We can look at what other people said about them during the time period. But the DNA actually gave us an opportunity to let these people speak for themselves.
Archaeologist Adam Aja said the DNA showed that even though the Philistines kept their culture physically, genetically they eventually blended in with the locals.
The discovery of the cemetery and the analysis of the bones definitively revealed that this population came from away and then slowly integrated into the local population.
The Philistines disappeared during the 6th century BC when the biblical king Nebuchadnezzar conquered the region. He destroyed Ashkelon and other cities at the time, shortly before the Judeans were exiled to Babylon, as described in the Bible. That's all for this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. Thanks for joining us. And remember, you can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. And remember, the God that's watching over Israel and you and me neither slumbers nor sleeps. I'm Julie Stahl. We'll see you next time on Jerusalem Dateline.